The autumn air in the Silver Oaks subdivision didn't smell like wood smoke or crisp leaves. It smelled like expensive mulch and industrial-grade lawn fertilizer. That was the first sign that things were orderly. In Silver Oaks, order was a religion, and Karen Mitchell was its high priestess. As the president of the Homeowners Association, Karen didn't just enforce the rules. She hunted for violations with the fervor of a bloodhound. I had moved to this suburban labyrinth 3 years ago, seeking peace after a decade of city living. I bought an old farmhouse that the developer had strangely left intact while building the cookie-cutter mansions around it. It came with 2 acres of land and a magnificent, stone-lined root cellar that sat about 50 yards behind the main house, tucked into a small hill. To me, it was a piece of history. To Karen, it was an unauthorized subterranean structure that marred the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. "It's an eyesore, Elias," Karen had told me during our very first encounter, her manicured finger pointing toward the moss-covered wooden doors of the cellar. "And the HOA guidelines are very clear about outbuildings. They must match the primary residence's siding and trim." "It's a root cellar, Karen," I had replied, trying to keep my voice level. "It's older than the state, and it's not an outbuilding. It's part of the landscape." That was the beginning of our Cold War. For 3 years, Karen had slapped me with fines for the length of my grass, the color of my mailbox, and the irregular shape of my driveway. But the root cellar remained her white whale. She wanted it gone, or at least modernized into something that looked like a plastic garden shed. The escalation happened on a Tuesday in late October. The sun was dipping low, casting long, skeletal shadows across my yard. I was in my upstairs office, finishing a freelance design project, when I saw a flash of neon pink through the window. I leaned closer to the glass. There she was. Karen Mitchell was trekking across my backyard, dressed in a designer tracksuit and clutching a clipboard like a weapon. She wasn't just walking the perimeter. She was heading straight for the hill. I watched, paralyzed by a mix of disbelief and morbid curiosity, as she reached the heavy oak doors of the root cellar. The cellar doors were secured with a simple iron latch and a heavy padlock. Not to keep out thieves, but to keep the neighborhood, kids from getting curious and hurting themselves on the steep stone steps. I saw Karen reach into her pocket, pull out what looked like a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and snip the lock with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first time breaking and entering. "You have got to be kidding me," I whispered to the empty room. She heaved the doors open, the old wood groaning in protest, with a quick glance around to see if she was being watched, failing to check the second story windows. She disappeared into the darkness of the cellar. My heart was pounding. My first instinct was to run out there and scream at her, but then a colder, more calculated thought took hold. Karen had spent years making my life a living hell, under the guise of community standards. She was currently trespassing on private property, damaging my locks, and entering a structure that was, by her own definition, unsafe and unauthorized. I slipped out my back door, moving quietly across the grass. The air was chilling rapidly as dusk settled in. As I approached the cellar, I could hear her muffled voice coming from inside. She was talking to herself, or perhaps recording a voice memo. Significant structural decay. Evidence of rodent infestation. Clear violation of health and safety. Code 4.2. I reached the doors. They were propped open about a foot. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. I didn't think about the HOA or the fines or the petty bickering. I thought about the sheer audacity of a woman who felt her title gave her the right to violate a man's home. I grabbed the heavy iron handles. With one swift, powerful motion, I slammed the door shut. The boom echoed through the quiet yard. I quickly slid the iron bolt into place. I didn't have a new lock, but the bolt was heavy, and the doors opened outward. From the inside, there was no handle, only the flat, reinforced wood. "Hey!" A muffled scream came from below. "Elias, is that you?" "Open this door immediately!" I didn't answer. I stood there for a moment, listening to her frantic pounding on the oak. It was a solid door. My grandfather had built it to withstand a tornado. "Elias, I know you're out there. This is HOA business. You are in serious trouble." I walked back to my house, the sound of her shouting fading into a dull thrum. I went straight to my kitchen, poured a glass of water, and picked up the phone. 911, what is your emergency?" "Yes, hello," I said, my voice remarkably calm. "I'd like to report a break-in. I've caught a trespasser in my root cellar. I've managed to lock them inside, but they sound quite agitated. I believe they might be armed with heavy tools." 10 minutes later, the quiet cul-de-sac of Silver. Oaks was lit up by the rhythmic strobing of red and blue lights. 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway, followed shortly by a third. Officers Miller and Rodriguez, both of whom I knew from the various noise complaints Karen had filed against me, stepped out. "Mr. Thorne?" Miller asked, adjusting his belt. "You said you have a trespasser?" "In the back," I said, gesturing with a flashlight. I saw someone cutting the lock on my cellar. I managed to slide the bolt before they could get out. As we walked toward the hill, the yelling from inside the cellar became audible again. It was a stream of invective that would have made a sailor blush. Karen was no longer citing HOA bylaws. She was screaming about lawsuits and her husband's connections at the city council. "Sounds like a live one," Rodriguez muttered. I stepped back as the officers approached the doors. "Open up, police," Miller shouted. The pounding stopped. "Oh, thank God," Karen's voice wailed, suddenly transforming from a screech to a damsel in distress whimper. "Officers, help me. I'm being held captive. The homeowner is a lunatic. He trapped me in here while I was performing an official inspection." Miller looked at me. I just shrugged and showed him the snapped padlock lying in the grass. "She used bolt cutters to get in, officer. I don't know many official inspections that start with property damage." Rodriguez pulled the bolt and heaved the doors open. Karen Mitchell emerged like a mole blinking in the sun. Her pink tracksuit was covered in cobwebs and coal dust. Her hair, usually a perfect helmet of blonde, was frizzed out and decorated with a dried leaf. She looked less like a neighborhood president and more like a swamp hag. "Arrest him," she barked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He kidnapped me. I am the president of the Silver Oaks HOA, and I was—" "Ma'am," Miller interrupted, his voice dry. "Did you have a warrant to enter this property?" "I don't need a warrant. I have the bylaws." "He has an unapproved structure. Did you cut this lock?" Rodriguez asked, holding up the severed steel. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to the bolt cutters still gripped in her hand. "It was an emergency. Structural, communities, property values were at stake." "Ma'am, step over to the car," Miller said, taking her arm. "You're being charged with criminal trespass and criminal mischief. And based on the screaming we heard, we might have to look into harassment charges as well." The HOA unfolded Facebook group, usually a haven for complaints about trash cans being left out too long, exploded that night. Someone had filmed the entire arrest from the sidewalk. The image of Karen Mitchell, covered in cellar grime and being shoved into the back of a cruiser, went viral within the zip. Code. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings. It turned out that Karen's official inspections had involved her trespassing on over a dozen properties in the neighborhood. Once I spoke up, other neighbors found the courage to come forward. There were stories of her peering through windows to check for non-compliant indoor window treatments, and even one instance of her digging up a neighbor's flower bed because the lilies were the wrong shade of orange. The Silver Oaks HOA board held an emergency meeting a month later. It was the most well-attended meeting in the history of the development. Karen was absent, her lawyer having advised her to stay far away from the neighborhood. I sat in the back row, watching as the board voted unanimously to strip Karen of her presidency and her membership. The atmosphere wasn't one of anger, but of profound relief. It was as if a heavy, suffocating blanket had been lifted off the community. After the meeting, the vice president, a quiet man named David who had lived in Karen's shadow for years, approached me. "Elias," he said, shaking my hand, "I think we owe you a thank you." We all knew she was over the line, but nobody wanted to be the one to pull the trigger. You literally shut the door on her. "I just wanted to keep my root cellar, David," I said with a smile. "About that," David said, looking nervous. The board discussed it. "We've decided that the cellar is a historical landmark of the Silver Oaks area. We're actually going to issue you a formal commendation for its preservation." I laughed. The irony was delicious. When I got home that night, I walked out to the back of the property. I had installed a new, much stronger lock on the cellar doors. I sat on the grass and looked at the old stones. The root cellar stood there, silent and sturdy, just as it had for over 100 years. It had survived winters, storms, and the rise of the suburbs. It had even survived Karen Mitchell. The Silver Oaks subdivision was still a place of rules and regulations, but the air felt different now. It felt like autumn, real autumn. The smell of wood smoke was finally drifting from a neighbor's chimney, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt truly at home. The HOA had finally been unfolded. And underneath all those layers of bureaucracy, it turned out there were actually some decent people. I looked at the cellar doors and gave them a small, appreciative pat. Sometimes to find peace, you just have to know when to close the door on the chaos. I went back inside, leaving the eyesore to sit proudly in the moonlight. A silent victor in the battle of the backyard. My house was quiet. My grass was slightly too long, and for once, everything was exactly as it should be.